Steve Gadd has spent decades in the shadows of fame, the silent architect behind some of music's most unforgettable songs. His drumming defined eras, carried legends, and gave rhythm to emotions too deep for words. Yet for all his mastery, Gadd rarely spoke of the people who shaped his journey. Now, at 80 years old, he finally breaks his silence about Paul Simon, the man whose brilliance, perfectionism, and mystery changed everything. What really happened between the quiet drummer and the relentless songwriter? Was their bond built on respect, tension, or something darker? The truth is finally here. Let's find out. The hidden bond between drummer and songwriter. Long before the world understood the weight of Steve Gadd's genius, fate was quietly setting the stage for his collision with Paul Simon. Born in Rochester, New York, Gadd was a prodigy hidden in plain sight, shaped by a local jazz scene that valued precision and soul. His hands, even as a boy, seemed to carry an ancient rhythm, a voice that couldn't be silenced. He moved through life unnoticed by most, but those who heard him knew something rare was unfolding. Meanwhile, Paul Simon was carving his own legend, his songwriting both delicate and merciless, his melodies sharpened by relentless pursuit of perfection. He was a man who demanded not just notes, but entire worlds in sound. For years, the two men moved in separate orbits, Simon rising to fame through folk and lyrical depth, Gadd building his reputation in smoky clubs and demanding studio sessions. The bond they would eventually form wasn't obvious, nor was it inevitable. But it was destined. Simon needed a drummer who could not only keep time, but bend it, stretch it, make it breathe. Gadd was the only one who could. Their connection would soon become both unshakable and quietly volatile, marked by brilliance, tension, and mystery. Chapter 2. From Rochester Roots to New York. Dreams. As Steve Gadd's story unfolded, it became clear that his life would never follow an ordinary script. For while many musicians dreamed of New York, chasing the shimmering promise of stages and studios, Gadd carried something deeper than ambition. A hunger not just to play, but to transform sound into meaning. His roots in Rochester had given him a foundation of discipline and soul, a training ground where jazz was less performance than communion, and where every bar carried the weight of history. He grew up surrounded by teachers and mentors who demanded precision, yet encouraged expression, shaping him into a drummer who could balance mathematical clarity with raw feeling. New York, with its restless energy, was the inevitable next step, a city that could either break him or reveal him. The moment he arrived, it became both battlefield and proving ground, a place where reputations were made not in years, but in single takes. In smoky clubs, he carved out a presence, his drumming both supportive and commanding, catching the ears of musicians who recognized instantly that he was not just another timekeeper, but a rare architect of rhythm. The recording studios soon followed, each session another test of nerve, where the red light flicked on and demanded perfection at first strike. For Gadd, the pressure was suffocating at times, but it was also liberating. Here, finally, was a stage where his gift could unfold without limits. Yet, with every triumph came the weight of expectation, a silent question hanging over him. Could he sustain brilliance under the merciless eyes of producers and artists who demanded nothing less than magic? Slowly, his reputation grew, whispered first among insiders and then spoken aloud by legends who sought him out, until his name became currency in a city overflowing with talent. And still, beneath the rising acclaim, Gadd remained quietly restless, driven not by fame, but by the search for the perfect groove, the rhythm that could carry emotion more honestly than words. New York did not simply elevate him, it refined him, sanding down rough edges, hardening his resilience and preparing him for the moment that would change everything. He didn't know it yet, but destiny was about to place a phone call that would forever bind him to one of the most exacting songwriters in history. And the quiet drummer from Rochester would soon find himself at the center of a partnership both brilliant and brutal. Chapter 3: Draft Papers, Army Bands, and Near Defeat. Just as Steve Gadd's rise seemed unstoppable, life delivered a letter that threatened to silence his drums forever. The Vietnam War draft. For countless young men, that envelope marked the end of possibility, a doorway to chaos and danger that few returned from unchanged. When Gadd's turn came, the weight of uncertainty fell hard. His carefully built future seemed ready to collapse in an instant. Yet fate, in its strange way, spared him the battlefield and instead placed him in the regimented world of army bands. It was not freedom, nor was it glory, but it was survival. And survival carried lessons. The uniform was heavy, the discipline suffocating, and individuality was often stripped away. Yet the drums remained his lifeline, his only true voice in a world that demanded conformity. In that rigid environment, Gadd discovered something invaluable: the art of precision under pressure. Every snare hit, every cymbal crash, every accent had to align with an exacting standard. There was no room for error, no space for improvisation unless sanctioned. Music became mechanical, stripped of glamour, but in its severity lay a strange gift. It forced Gadd to refine his technique until it was flawless, automatic, and unshakable. Still, beneath that forced control burned a need for something more, a hunger for music that breathed, that moved, that carried emotion rather than simply executing orders. On sleepless nights, staring at barracks walls, he wondered if destiny had abandoned him, if his dream of becoming a musician had been swallowed by duty. Yet the truth was more complicated. The army didn't extinguish his fire. It forged it, tempering raw talent into steel. By the time he walked out of service, he was not merely a drummer, but a weapon, sharpened by discipline and waiting unknowingly for the moment that would define him. The war years had threatened to derail his life, but instead, they became the crucible that hardened his resolve, ensuring that when the world came calling, when Paul Simon came calling, Steve Gadd would not only be ready, he would be undeniable. Chapter 4: The Day Paul Simon first called. It was the kind of phone call every struggling musician dreams of, but never dares expect, the kind that arrives without warning and carries with it the weight of destiny. For Steve Gadd, recently freed from military duty and carving out a reputation in New York's crowded studios, the voice on the other end was both electrifying and intimidating: Paul Simon. By then, Simon was no ordinary songwriter. He was already a cultural monument, a man whose words and melodies had defined a generation. Yet, despite his towering reputation, Simon was restless, searching for something new, something alive, something that couldn't be captured by metronomes or sheet music. He wanted a drummer who could translate emotion into rhythm, who could shape silence as effectively as sound, who could bend time without breaking it. When Gadd arrived at the studio, the air was thick with expectation. Engineers hovered, tape machines whirred, and Simon, sharp-eyed and meticulous, studied him with the intensity of a craftsman evaluating raw material. Gadd sat behind the kit, sticks trembling not with fear but with the enormity of possibility. Then he played, and in that moment, something shifted. His groove didn't just keep time, it breathed, expanded, contracted, filling Simon's melodies with a pulse that felt both inevitable and completely new. Fills landed like conversation, accents whispered and roared in perfect balance, and the room, once tense, seemed to exhale. Simon, known for his relentless demands, paused, listening, realizing he had found not just a drummer, but a partner. For Gadd, the session was more than another gig. It was a crossing of thresholds, a door swinging open to a future neither man could fully predict, but both could feel vibrating in the air. That first call was no ordinary opportunity. It was the spark of a collaboration that would alter the trajectory of popular music, binding the quiet prodigy from Rochester to one of the world's most exacting songwriters in a partnership that would be both brilliant and bruising. The drummer had been tested, and he had passed, not just with skill, but with soul. Chapter 5. Studio Secrets That Changed Music Forever. The recording studio became both battlefield and sanctuary for Paul Simon and Steve Gadd, a place where brilliance was born not in harmony but in the tension between obsession and instinct. For Simon, perfection was never optional. Every chord had to shimmer with intention. Every lyric needed to land with surgical precision, and no detail was too small to dissect. Many musicians buckled under that weight, drained by endless takes and the sharp edge of Simon's relentless ear. But Gadd was different. He didn't flinch under scrutiny. He thrived in it, translating Simon's restless visions into rhythms that felt less like accompaniment and more like prophecy. During the sessions for Still Crazy After All These Years, Gadd's drumming did more than support the songs. It transformed them, giving them a backbone so distinctive that they could never be mistaken for anyone else's work. The most striking moment came with 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, when Gadd conjured a drum pattern that seemed to arrive from nowhere. A linear groove so unusual and hypnotic that even Simon was startled. It was syncopated, airy, off-center, yet grounded, bending rules in ways that made traditionalists blink and listeners lean closer. What should have been strange became unforgettable, turning the song into one of Simon's greatest hits and cementing Gadd's reputation as not just a drummer, but an innovator. Yet behind the magic was struggle. Simon's perfectionism often clashed with Gadd's intuitive artistry. What Gadd felt was alive on the first or second take might be pushed into lifelessness by the 10th. Still, Gadd endured, knowing that genius often comes wrapped in torment. The public heard only the polished masterpieces, songs that seemed effortless, grooves that felt eternal, but inside those studio walls lay stories of exhaustion, frustration, and rare moments of transcendence when all the friction coalesced into brilliance. These were the secrets never printed in liner notes, the arguments, the silences, the near-breaking points, and the fleeting instants when everything clicked, and history was quietly written, beat by beat. Chapter 6. Clash of Perfection. Simon versus Gadd. As the partnership between Paul Simon and Steve Gadd deepened, so too did the friction. For what began as mutual admiration soon evolved into a constant test of endurance, a battle between Simon's legendary perfectionism and Gadd's instinctive artistry. Simon was relentless, known to push musicians until their hands ached and their confidence fractured, dissecting takes with the cold precision of a surgeon hunting for flaws, invisible to anyone else. Many who entered his studio left shaken, unwilling to endure the grind. But Gadd was not like other drummers. He didn't crumble under pressure. He resisted in his own quiet way. When Simon demanded yet another take, ears straining for microscopic errors, Gadd would deliver with calm steadiness. But there were moments when he simply refused to compromise, knowing when a groove carried a soul that repetition would only suffocate. To Gadd, music wasn't mathematics, it was breath and pulse, a heartbeat that could be measured only in feeling. Sometimes he pushed back by holding his ground in silence, letting the weight of his refusal speak louder than words, a subtle defiance in the face of Simon's control. The tension that simmered between them was both destructive and creative, a volatile current that produced sparks of conflict but also flashes of transcendence. When Simon's sharp edges collided with Gadd's unshakable intuition, the result was music that neither man could have conjured alone, songs alive with the paradox of control and freedom, precision and imperfection. What the public eventually heard were flawless masterpieces, rhythms that seemed effortless and eternal. But what they didn't hear were the sighs between takes, the quiet arguments, the exhausted silence that followed battles neither man fully won. It was never an easy partnership. It was a dance of wills, a collision of obsessions. But it was in that friction, as painful as it was, that their greatest triumphs were born, proving that sometimes genius is not found in harmony, but in the clash of two men unwilling to yield. Chapter 7. The tension behind the timeless hits. Every timeless song has a shadow, and behind Paul Simon's most celebrated works, that shadow was often the tension that simmered between him and Steve Gadd, an unspoken battle that gave the music its sharp edge. To the public, the records sounded flawless. Immaculate arrangements, unforgettable grooves, lyrics etched into memory as if they had always existed. But inside the recording booth, the air was heavy with unease, charged with the friction of two men pulling in opposite directions, yet somehow landing in the same place. Simon thrived on control, dissecting takes with obsessive detail until musicians lost faith in their own instincts, his perfectionism both awe-inspiring and suffocating. Gadd, though, carried a different kind of authority, one born not from command, but from feel, from knowing instinctively when a take had life, when the groove contained something that could never be recreated no matter how many times it was repeated. To him, music was fragile. If pushed too hard, the spark could vanish. This clash of philosophies made their sessions grueling, punctuated by long silences, sharp glances, and the quiet weight of frustration. Yet it was precisely this conflict that elevated the music. Simon's drive forced Gadd to reach deeper, to refine his playing beyond limits he might not have otherwise touched, while Gadd's resistance preserved the humanity in Simon's crystalline visions. The irony was profound. The very struggle that left them exhausted gave birth to songs that sounded effortless. Tracks like Late in the Evening and 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover carried within them the imprint of this tug-of-war, polished to perfection, yet still pulsing with life, as if the rhythm itself bore the scars of their battles. To fans, these were songs of joy, wit, and beauty. To those who lived inside the studio walls, they were monuments built on tension, each groove a compromise, each melody a hard-won victory. For Gadd, the hits were triumphs that carried weight beyond applause, for he knew that behind every note lay a battlefield where respect and frustration had collided, and though the public heard only magic, he carried the memory of the fight it took to create it. Chapter 8. How Gadd's drums rescued Paul's career. By the mid-1970s, Paul Simon stood at a crossroads. The folk era that had made him a legend was fading, and the cultural landscape was shifting fast. To remain relevant, he needed not just new songs, but a new sound, something that could bridge sophistication with accessibility. The answer arrived through Steve Gadd's drums. When Gadd created the now iconic groove for 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, It did more than anchor the song. It redefined Simon's musical identity. The crisp, syncopated rhythm gave the track a freshness that no folk ballad could deliver. Radio stations couldn't ignore it. Audiences were captivated not only by Simon's clever lyrics, but by the hypnotic pulse driving underneath. For Simon, it was salvation. Without Gadd's drumming, the album Still Crazy After All These Years might have been remembered as a respectable but unremarkable work. With it, the record soared, earning Simon Grammy recognition and renewed cultural power. Insiders knew the truth. Gadd's creativity didn't just enhance Simon's career, it rescued it. The drummer who once wondered if his future had been lost to the military became the invisible architect of a superstar's second act. Yet, in the shadows, Gadd received little credit, his role whispered but rarely celebrated. Chapter 9. Fame, Burnout, and Walking Away. The climb to success came at a cost. For Steve Gadd, constant demand from Paul Simon and later countless other stars pushed him into a relentless cycle of studio sessions, tours, and pressure. On the surface, he was living every musician's dream, working with legends, shaping hits that defined generations. But behind the curtain, exhaustion crept in. The grind of perfection began to eat away at him. Simon's endless requests, combined with the demands of other artists, left little space for rest or reflection. Nights blurred into mornings, studios into hotel rooms. The drums, once his lifeline, began to feel like shackles. Even the applause of sold-out audiences couldn't silence the fatigue growing inside him. By the early 1980s, the signs were clear. Gadd's health faltered, his spirit dimmed, and whispers of burnout followed him from session to session. He was too valuable to lose, yet too drained to continue at the same punishing pace. And so, he stepped back. Walking away wasn't easy, especially from a partnership as powerful as his with Paul Simon. But survival demanded it. Fame had given him everything, and nearly taken everything too. In silence, Gadd retreated, leaving behind questions no one dared to ask aloud. Chapter 10. Silent Years. Why Gadd refused to speak. When Steve Gadd stepped back, the silence was deafening. For decades, he had been the invisible backbone of Paul Simon's greatest works. Yet, as he withdrew from the spotlight, he chose not to explain. Interviews skirted the subject. Journalists pressed lightly, but Gadd never opened the vault. Why? The answer lay in his personality. Gadd was a craftsman, not a celebrity. To him, the music was the story, and drummers weren't meant to steal the stage. But silence also protected him. Speaking openly about Paul Simon, about the late nights, the clashes, the exhaustion, would have exposed fractures that the industry preferred to keep hidden. Simon was a star, a cultural icon, untouchable in reputation. For Gadd to reveal the full weight of their working relationship might have been seen as betrayal. So he carried the burden privately. Friends noticed his weariness, his hesitation to revisit certain memories, but Gadd shielded the public from the truth. The price was high. While Simon's legacy grew, Gadd's role remained understated. His contributions whispered in liner notes rather than shouted on stages. His silence became its own scandal, a mystery haunting fans and musicians alike. What secrets lay behind those unspoken words? Why guard them so fiercely? Only time would finally break his resolve. Chapter 11. At 80. Breaking the silence. 80 years. That's how long Steve Gadd carried the weight of his story before finally choosing to share it. Age has a way of loosening the tongue, of reminding even the most private men that legacies aren't built on silence alone. When Gadd finally opened up, the music world braced itself. He didn't speak with bitterness. He never was that kind of man. Instead, his words carried the weight of reflection, tinged with both gratitude and exhaustion. He admitted what so many had suspected. Working with Paul Simon was both the greatest gift and the greatest challenge of his career. The brilliance was undeniable, but so was the strain. The sessions that gave the world immortal songs often left scars invisible to the public. What stunned many was Gadd's honesty about his near-breaking points. The endless takes, the creative standoffs, the quiet battles of control. These weren't footnotes, but central to their dynamic. And yet, through it all, Gadd never dismissed Simon's genius. Instead, he painted a picture of complexity, a man who could inspire and suffocate, elevate and exhaust, sometimes in the same breath. At 80, Gadd seemed liberated by the telling. The silence was over. For the first time, the public glimpsed the truth, not just about the music, but about the human cost behind it. His confession wasn't scandal for scandal's sake. It was legacy finally given its full dimension. Chapter 12. The Truth About Paul Simon, Friend or Foe. The question lingered in every interview, every article, every whispered conversation among musicians. What, in the end, was Paul Simon to Steve Gadd? Was he a friend, a partner in genius, or a relentless taskmaster who left wounds beneath the glory? Gadd's final reflections didn't provide an easy answer. He described Simon as a man impossible to categorize, at once inspiring and infuriating, generous yet demanding beyond reason. Simon's brilliance pushed Gadd to create rhythms that reshaped popular music, grooves that will outlive both men. Yet the price of that brilliance was tension, fatigue, and years of unspoken conflict. In moments, Simon was a friend, laughing quietly after a successful take, sharing rare glimpses of vulnerability. In others, he was an uncompromising tyrant of the studio, blind to exhaustion, deaf to anything less than perfection. Gadd, ever the professional, endured it all, transforming frustration into rhythm. At 80, reflecting on decades of collaboration, Gadd didn't cast Simon as villain or saint. He revealed him as human, flawed, brilliant, demanding, and unforgettable. And perhaps that honesty was the greatest gift Gadd could give, not a sanitized legend, but a real story of two men bound by music, conflict, and respect. For fans, the revelation was staggering. Behind the timeless hits lay a truth both sobering and deeply human. Was Simon friend or foe? Maybe both. And maybe that's why their music still resonates. It was born from contradiction, carved from struggle, and delivered with a rawness that only truth can create. Outro. Steve Gadd's silence is broken, and the truth about Paul Simon now echoes louder than any drum beat. Their bond was brilliance wrapped in conflict, respect laced with scars. History remembers the songs, but now we know the cost. What do you think? Friendship, rivalry, or both? Subscribe and join the conversation.